This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
We now have Dr. Viviane Carvalho da Annunciaçao, and she's going to talk to us about something I confess I know nothing about, so that's the third one of the morning, and we're going to learn about that. She holds a degree, of a PhD rather, in literary studies from USP, but she also has a lot of connection with the UK, including being the author of a book on Northern Irish poetry, which must stand you out somewhat from the crowd. Yeah. Anyway, we're fascinated to hear what you have to say about the concrete poetry in Brazil and Britain and public and private exchanges. Over to you.
Thank you. Thank you for. I want to thank the organizers for giving me the opportunity to present my postdoctorate research on concrete poetry in Brazil and the UK. So, when examining the exchange of letters between the poets Mário de Andrade and Carlos Drummond de Andrade, the Brazilian literary critic Silviano Santiago argues that writers' letters are based on a self-reflecting exercise. At the same time, the act of writing forces the author to critically engage with his or her formal choices. It also requests an answer which acts as an antidote or an antidepressant for the subjective predicament. This assertion embraces a traditional idea of friendship, which, according to Jacques Derrida, not only disregards the element of difference, but also reproduces another form of egoistic belief in ourselves. While Santiago identifies letters with the powerful downpour of mutual confessions, he dismisses another point completely out of hand. This ignored point is precisely the insurmountable value letters have in the figuration of a heterogeneous diffusion of avant-garde movements. In my view, the double bind between personal friendship through epistolary confession and the collective promotion is the feature that characterizes the correspondence between Brazilian and British concrete poetry. This paper aims to show how the idea of friendship based on difference or on the mutual acceptability of similarities and conflicting beliefs has contributed to the private and public exchanges of concrete poetry in Brazil and the United Kingdom. So the very outset of the Brazilian and British creative exchange was mediated through a letter. According to Edwin Morgan and Alec Finlay, the first mentioning of concrete poetry from Brazil was published in the Times Literary Supplement of the 25th of May, 1962, in which the Portuguese poet Melo e Castro drew attention to the concrete movement of Brazil. In fact, Melo sent a letter in order to criticize an article of the previous issue, Poetry, Prose and Machine, which failed to mention the Noigandres group. So here you have the letter. For him, the concrete poem would replace traditional verse altogether and give an interdisciplinary and modern outlook to poetry. This letter was persuasive enough for some British authors to engage in formal debate with Brazilian artists. The first one was Ian Hamilton Finlay, who on the 14th of June of the same year wrote to Augusto de Campos, asking for his contribution to the 5th number of his poetic journal, Poor Old Tired Horse. Without hesitation, it's a great name, Poor Old Tired Horse, I love it. Without hesitation, Augusto de Campos replied to Finlay, offering the poems and offering the Noigandres anthology, which included a pilot plan for concrete poetry. So this is the letter that Augusto sent to him. At the same time, he also at the same time he contributed to the journal, he also used the letter as a medium for circulation of his poetic project and of the Neugandris poetic project. So in some part of the letter, he mentions that our group edits its own poems in a collective book, Neugandris, and he also mentions that their work was also being published in Germany and other parts of the UK. So it was also a promotional idea. It is clear that the beginning of the correspondence between the poets was not confessional or personal, but an artistic dialogue of creative minds who were trying to come to terms with a new form of approaching the poetic act. It's relevant to mention that even though the letters were in English, the difference between languages, which is so vital for so many forms of traditional poetry, is inexpressive here. So these are the Brazilian poems published in Poor Tired Horse. The Brazilian poems were published in 1963, entirely in Portuguese, and differed enormously from the volume as a whole. While many of the poems published on the 5th number were still based on traditional verse, the pieces by Augusto de Campos and Pedro Xistos surpassed the frontiers between languages and offered an organic interaction between form and image. Moreover, they were also printed in a landscape mode, which required a different form of reading. In addition to the artistic interest, Finlay was also motivated to experiment with the procedures that the Brazilians were working with. In a letter to the American poet Robert Creeley, he mentions, "We are printing 3 concrete poems from Brazil. I find them fascinating and lovely. Have you seen any? I like the idea of the thing being the very minimum. I try to write a couple myself." From his words, it's quite clear that the poems were already changing his artistic perception. At the same time, Finlay was in contact with Augusto, another Scottish poet who was engaging on creative and critical debate of concrete poetry. Edwin Morgan, on the 8th of August 1963, soon after the publication of Poor Tired Horse, wrote a letter to Augusto de Campos, thanking him for sending the poetic journal Invenção, number 2. Even though my research could not trace the letter that triggered the correspondence between Augusto and Edwin Morgan, it is possible to infer that the Neugandris group had invited both him and Finlay to publish their work in Invenção number 4, since Morgan commented on the layout of his poems. In addition to the Scottish poets, the volume presented poems by Eugene Gominger, Vladimir Mayakovsky, among others. This mutual publication of Brazilian poets in Britain and British poets in Brazil produced a much wider web of interactions, which would surpass discrete manifestation. In the same letter, Morgan states. So here you have some evidence of this of his publication in Brazil of this correspondence. Soon after, Morgan also writes to Finlay, reaffirming his wish to publish his translations of the Neugandris group and on the Times Literary Supplement. So in both letters, he keeps reinforcing that the idea that those poems were modern and that the TSL was somewhat conservative, so he didn't know if they were going to accept. Such a special attention given to Brazilian poetry stemmed from Morgan's also political reading of concrete poetry. Even though social commitment was a feature which was present in the movement right from the start, Brazilian critics dismissed such an ideological aspect of their art. Quite on the contrary, the Brazilian critics disregarded concrete poetry as apolitical, too much aesthetic. However, Morgan stated that he was struck by the variety of approaches, variety of forms of concrete poetry in Brazil, because they could incorporate effects of satire, irony, and direct commitment. He also highlighted that the poem Cuba Sim, Yankee Não was a masterpiece, and that it bore comparison to African American engaged poetry of that time. Actually, the poem was not called Cuba Sim, Yankee Não, but Cuba Grama. So this is the poem that called his attention. Instead of being a simplistic anti-North American poem, Campos produced a political message on a multi-dimensional level. Extremely ahead of its time, the poem deconstructed both capitalist and socialist ideologies through a complex disposition and fragmentation of words, which generated symbolic and metonymical representations of the United States, of Cuba, and of Brazil. The colors white, red, blue, green, and yellow are particularly representative of these countries. The 9 set of squares composes a bigger frame through which the poet creates units of meaning that represent the conflicting landscape of Latin American politics at that time. Instead of producing a single meaning, the Cuba Grama points to a myriad of interpretation which stem precisely from the multiplicity of the meanings of its own title, gram. So etymologically, it means form of writing. It also stands for the measuring unit typical of South America, grama. And additionally, the title of the Cuban newspaper, Grama, which reports governmental decisions. Such a variety of meanings does not allow the reader to simply regard the sentence Cuba Sim, Yankee Não as a summary of the whole poem. At the same time, it reaffirms a brazen anti-North American ideology. The smaller captions recreate geographical microcosms, such as, so here in the second square, you can see Cuba, o deus do açúcar. Dólar, o Brasil sim. A América, o Brasil entre as estrelas. I don't think so. Sorry. Salve o Brasil, esmolas para o progresso, aliança que não. And the one in the middle, it has a lot of yes, eu, yes, OEA, OEA, yes, eu, EUA, yes, OEA. So in addition to these sentences, the words can be combined in different ways. So you don't have to read from left to right, but you can read in different directions. So it produces more variations of the same theme. However, what binds all these together is the symbolic affirmation of Cuba's sugar economy and Brazilian submission to the North American leadership, especially due to the mentioning of OEA, Organização dos Estados Americanos, that expelled post-revolutionary Cuba. Even though Morgan did not grasp the most obscure subtleties of the poem, his voice was fundamental to concrete poetry from Brazil. Even more when the Times literary supplement of the 3rd of September 1964 published theoretical articles and poems by the Brazilian Noigandras group. The editor of the volume praised the Brazilian poets not only for their ability to create new and meaningful concepts with their work, but also for their grasp of the new sensibility that was being developed on the readers and general public due to the rise of technology, due to the rise of media and television. His argument was very similar to Walter Benjamin's ideas that the cinema created a new sensibility, a new appreciation of the public. For the editor, the new avant-garde poetry was the result of such a change in artistic paradigms. Décio Pignatari's article, Concrete Poets from Brazil, is not only a panorama of concrete poets from Brazil, but a pioneer study on a new poetic language. For him, art should include new technologies and be buttressed by semiotic and communication theory. Pignatari argued for a poetic language that could transform its reality through the creation of new linguistic codes. For him, each poem was responsible for creating its own reality, which means it should not stand for something or represent something, but simply be something. For that, he proposed the creation of projected and constructed languages that would function according to the artist's necessity. In addition to citing names of the leading figures of the movement, concrete experiments by Haroldo de Campos, Ronaldo Azeredo, here you have the page, Décio Pignatari were published in the same volume. Breaking stereotypes about Brazil and inserting in the heterogeneity of the verse the diversity of its culture. These three poems selected for publication address the theme of football, and I'm going to focus more on these poems about football. The first one was by Augusto de Campos, and it was very political. So I have a new re-edition published on his most recent volume. Through a wit play with dates and words, the poet established a contrast between the years when the Brazilian football team won its first World Cups and the year when it suffered the military coup. Interestingly enough, the poet was just able to publish this poem in London, because if it had done that in Brazil or in any other Brazilian newspapers, he would have been censored. Nevertheless, the poem ultimately is about language and how a slight change of letters can result in a significant transformation of meaning and concepts. Also, the title, between inverted commas, football, implied that there was a secret game happening at the same time the Brazilian people were engrossed with the artistry of its players, such as Pelé, Tostão, and Garrincha. It faintly reaffirms Karl Marx's famously quoted phrase that religion is the opium of the masses. In Brazil, football acted, and in some way still does, as a social cement in the same way that religion did. The graphic similarity between the words goal and jail is the link between mass entertainment and political oblivion, which results in alienation and exploitation. On the same page, the reader could find the poem Football by Décio Pignatari. Differently from Augusto de Campos, the poem held a radical premise: the substitution of the traditional alphabet for linguistic symbolic keys, or ideograms, as concrete poets wished to achieve. In the example about the most famous football player Pelé, the poet conveys an open-ended message in which the reader becomes an active participant in the construction of meanings. For each of the 6 ideograms, which can also be interpreted as a substitute traditional stanza, there is a meaning created according to the placement of the keys. Similarly to the Oriental languages' ideograms, the position of the traces guide the reader and construct the sentence. In the first ideogram, the ball, which stands for Pelé, is fragmented inside the rectangle that represents the wish for everything to be all right at the end. As for the As for the diamond shape in the middle, it figures as a representation of the country due to the similarity with the Brazilian flag. Additionally, it corresponds to the popular saying that when Brazilian football team plays, the country wear football boots. The second and third symbols stand for an imaginary game in which Pelé is inside and outside of the country. The fourth represents a change in which Pelé is not only one but two, which means that there were other players who could reach his level. In a probable reference to Garrincha, the other player who made a huge difference in the final of 1962 Chilean World Cup. The fifth symbol is more enigmatic because it shows the circle, Pelé in two. It also a reference to an actual fact of the World Cup of 62 in which Pelé could not play due to a muscular sprain on his right thigh. This drawback, though, could not prevent the Brazilian team from winning the tournament against all the odds. The last symbol is a representation of this fact, and Pelé is amplified in a bow shape, and the country is fulfilled in its desire for victory. It's a positive poem, differently from Augustus. The third poem in the page is by Ronaldo Azeredo. Without addressing the theme of football, the poet composes an enigmatic portrayal of work and torpor. Falling back on the graphic pattern of chess and checkers board, Azeredo tackles the dynamics of daily labor, which involves more torpor than work. Given that the poem is about Brazil, it was written in Brazil in the 60s, it also reflects another leftist thesis that the proletariat class is alienated from its work, since it does not profit from its labor. This perverse dynamics is highly enhanced after the military coup in which the government prohibited freedom of speech and the democratic vote. As the chess pieces and board reflects the medieval classes, Azeredo proposes the view of an invisible and anonymous worker whose life is taken by an apathetic state of quasi-mental and sensitive activity. In all of the poems, the reader is summoned to interact with the symbols in order to retrace the creative steps taken by the poets. Rather than reading them passively, the poets create a dynamic understanding that happens when each individual tries to retrace their montage. So it's an active reading. However, instead of offering a single possibility, as I may have done this can be opened up to different interpretations and understanding. Each person can retrace individually those steps differently and generate new meanings and ideas. These poems were exactly the ones that inspired Finlay to write to Stephen Bann on the 14th of September 1966 and elaborate even more on their revolutionary methods. And he says, I don't understand it at all. So it's very interesting that he was so much fascinated by those poems, but at the same time he mentioned that he could not grasp them fully. Even though there is a degree of misunderstanding on the part of Finlay, it's quite clear that the Scottish poet appreciated the linguistic interplay with different codes and representations of the figure of Pelé. It could be possible that Finlay knew little about Brazilian history, but his creative method was already changed by what he saw and experienced when retracing the montage, retracing those steps. This particular issue also included texts that described and argued for a new avant-garde forms of art, such as the Vienna Group. It is relevant to point that the Changing Guard 1 was published on the 6th of August and included articles and poems by Don Sylvester, Finlay, and Edwin Morgan. The importance of these articles and poems were such that Finlay dedicated the volume 21 of Poor Old Tired Horse to the poet Edgar Braga, also from São Paulo. So this is his journal. The poems varied between verbal and vocal experiments such as Firefly. So the sing, não, sing is a Firefly poem. And also more abstract ones that teetered on the verge of abstract paintings such as the boat. In the same year, Ian Hamilton Finlay published at the Brighton Festival the poem Star Steer, which bears similarities to the work produced by the concrete poets from Brazil. And you can see here parallel, those two procedures are quite similar. While Melo e Castro was the connection between Morgan and Finlay and Augusto de Campos, Ian Hamilton Finlay was the mediator between Stephen Bann and the Brazilian Noigandres group, especially Augusto de Campos and Pedro Xisto. Bann was still a PhD student of history of art at King's College, Cambridge, when he, along with Philip Stedman and Michael Weaver, edited the art journal Form, which was dedicated to avant-garde forms of art. In the first volume of 1966, Bann translated the activity of structuralism by Roland Barthes and published poems by Xisto. In his foreword to his translation of the activity of structuralism, he explained that those poems it shows the new relationship of the work of art and the world. With this foreword, the three poems by Pedro Xisto acquired the purpose of presenting a change in artistic representation. Through the use of a mirroring technique, which involved an interchange of symbolic representations that emptied the word from the reference to reality, Xisto invited the readers to have different relationships with the language. In the case of the poem Yearn, its letters are spread in order to create a cascade of words that can be read in alternate ways. The poem Star Astro and Rat Ostra opposes ethereal and earthly elements. Star and Astro and Rat and Ostra. In the case of stars, the first letters are interchanged in order to create a reversible effect. Oyster, though, isolates the letter O in the beginning of the word in order to imitate the circularity of the pearl and the circularity of the pearl. The poem Babel alludes to the impossibility of communication in the plurality of languages and symbolic representations. So going towards a conclusion, so there were more correspondences, there were more poems involved in this exchange. Through the examples previously mentioned, it is hard to accept the hypothesis that letters are confessional mediums of creative exchange. Much on the contrary, in the case of concrete poetry in Brazil and the United Kingdom, letters brought about reflection, artistic experimentations, and intellectual conceptualization. In addition to that, they created an independent medium of international circulation of poetry, when letters were the only available tool for international communication.